Okay, this is another excerpt from this book, Rhyme, Rhetoric, and Logic, that I wrote, fourth edition here. This is the excerpt on the section on metaphor. So this is writing lecture number 3. I can't do entire chapters because the chapters are too long. Okay, so litotes, and basically, again, this is all rhetoric, forms of rhetoric, and they come from the Greeks recognizing the best speakers use characteristic patterns of speaking, and they wrote them all down so that they could help develop more excellent speakers in ancient Greece. So litotes just means understatement for effect. For example, Newton had a good mind for science. He's the greatest scientist who ever lived. Okay, metonymy. The Greek names are kind of difficult. Aristotle classified all this stuff. What I would do is just make up names that are similar to the Greek name that will help me remember. So metonymy, metonymy, middle naming. What is the sort of essence of something? And for example, like when the executives walk by, those are the suits, okay? The Mark Antony speech by Shakespeare. Friends, Romans, and countrymen, lend me your ears. So the ears would be the metonymy there. Like when a teenager gets a car, his friends say, hey man, I heard you got some wheels. So the wheels is the metonymy. It's sort of like the essential key detail that calls to mind everything else. In the forest, a hoof footprint, is metonymy for a deer, multiple for a wolf. Okay, so metaphor is really, considered by a lot of people who thought about it like the most extraordinary thing about the human mind. That's how we judge everything, by comparing it to something else. And a lot of the best metaphors, they come like right in those couple of minutes before you wake up and get out of bed. It's as if your subconscious mind has been working on some question that you've been thinking about the last day or so, and then your subconscious mind figures it out while you're asleep, and right when you're starting to wake up, it tells you, hey, here's your metaphor, here's the answer. So, it's a good time to get out of bed and write it down real fast so you don't forget it. Sometimes, too, having a conversation with somebody can bring to mind a good metaphor. And I've noticed a lot of times I'll listen to an audiobook in the car that'll be kind of easy for me. Like I already know nutrition pretty well, let's say, but I'm just listening to some audiobook, I'll get an idea. Or for any subject that happens, I'll be listening to anything about history, whatever. So I love listening to those audiobooks in the car. It gives me lots of ideas. All right, I have a little note card in my car. I only write when I'm stopped at a stoplight, but I'll write an idea, and I hear a great quote in the car, boom, I'll write that idea down. Okay, metaphor is the magic of metaphor, comparing one thing, but you state it as something else. So a metaphor requires the reader to make a jump of logic, and that gives them the sense of an epiphany, and that's why a metaphor is more powerful than a simile. A simile is just to say this is like something else. Because the listener makes the comparison for themselves. Neil Postman, he's a good writer. He said, a metaphor is an organ of perception. Through metaphors, we see the world as one thing or another. And that's true. Once you've got that metaphor in mind, and it's a key concept, a lot of times you can understand a whole new area of thought. Like, for example, I heard Ayn Rand made a quote, there's no contradictions. If you think there's a contradiction, one of your premises is incorrect. Rethink your premises. And that helped me to figure out a lot of complicated things. Another good one was a quote by Carlyle. He said, there's always a good reason, and then there's the real reason. So usually you get, people try to, BS you all the time. And they'll give you some reason that sounds reasonable, plausible, logical, but it sounds weak, underpowered. And then you think about it some more, there'll be some true meaning, because they want money or something else that's the true meaning. So you got to be aware of that as well. Okay, metaphor enables us to see a new thing through the perspective of an old thing, with the perspective and the vocabulary of the old thing. So the initial metaphor gets your cognitive foot in the door, and then the perspective of the old thing enables you to navigate the new thing. I mean, that's how we learn everything, by comparing the new thing to things we already know, and its similarities and dissimilarities to what we already know. So here's a good metaphor. This is a guy, Bruce Lipton. He had some good lectures about molecular biology. And here's his quote by Bruce Lipton. The cell membrane is the brain of a cell because that's where perception occurs. That's where decisions are made about how to respond to the environment. The DNA is just a copy of the blueprints. The DNA does not make the decision. That's an important statement because getting that also helps you to understand cancer. Cancer is much more of a mitochondrial disease than a DNA disease. The somatic mutation theory is bogus in comparison with the metabolic theory of cancer. That's an important thing to know. That tells you tons of things about cancer. I would even say if you're going to have any understanding of cancer, you need to know that. And a lot of people don't know that. A lot of doctors don't know that. Okay, psychoanalysis is based on mendacious metaphors. So you got some alliteration in there as well. Thomas Szasz, MD, he's a psychiatrist. Guy's a brilliant guy. He wrote a great book called The Myth of Psychiatry. It's one of the best psychology books you'll ever read. It's fantastic. Okay, metaphor asserts sameness, while simile asserts likeness. So a good metaphor we talked about. It can be a template for thinking. Apt analogies are formidable tools of the rhetorician. Yeah, a lot of people, they can't fight back against a metaphor. You give them a metaphor that gets their attention, they don't have the intellectual power, logic, or skill to think otherwise. Like you say the word good fats in the Mediterranean diet, and the average stupid person is hypnotized by that, and they'll eat bad food for 20 years after they heard that. Okay, analogy is the heartbeat of thought. We use analogies to compare the new to the old, to categorize the new. This guy, Douglas Hofstadter, he wrote a book. It's like about 500 pages about metaphors. And I started reading it, and I actually enjoyed the book. Even though it's, it's a lot longer than it has to be, it was still quite entertaining. I enjoyed it. He's got some YouTube videos that are pretty good. Okay, here's Stephen Jay Gould, the quote. He's an evolutionary biologist, and I actually disagree with him about a lot of things in evolutionary biology, but he was certainly interesting to read. I used to read his books when I was in college and talk about them with my biology friends. Okay, so here's Stephen Jay Gould's quote. If genius has any common denominator, I would propose ability to construct fruitful analogies between fields. Yeah, that's a key thing. Metaphor is a beholder. For example, atherosclerosis. I couldn't understand atherosclerosis with the cholesterol theory. It always seemed kind of underpowered and stupid. But then when I learned atherothrombosis theory, man, I could figure out everything from there in atherosclerosis, and that was very useful. I learned that from that Gregory Sloop pathologist. He sort of figured it out, and I learned it from him, and then I could figure out the other stuff. Okay, metaphor is bolder, more confident, implicit. A simile is tamer. It's more logical and explicit. So a simile would be something like, for example, the world is a theater stage in a play. It's like a theater stage in a play. Okay, then you hear Shakespeare's version of it. Same idea phrased in a metaphor. All the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts. His act being 7 ages. Okay, it's Shakespeare from his play As You Like It. Some of these are kind of like standard literary metaphors. Okay, metaphor shows, a simile tells, and so here's a little more Shakespeare. But soft, what light on yonder window breaks. It is the east, and Juliet is the sun. So Juliet is the sun is a metaphor. If he said Juliet is like the sun, that would be a simile. It just carries more power when you say Juliet is the sun. Okay, metaphor, it's more emotionally stirring. Here's Sonnet 18 of Shakespeare. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Because it's making the reader do some work and figure it out, it sort of jumps them to an understanding that's just better. Metaphor is the most beautiful of tropes. That's from Quintilian. Quintilian was sort of the rhetorician. He ran a school of learning public speaking, and he followed after Cicero. He greatly admired Cicero. So Cicero and Quintilian are the two great orators of ancient Rome. And they certainly greatly admired the Greeks. Cicero went to Greece, and he helped translate a bunch of Greek books into Latin. Cicero is the greatest of all the Romans. If you ever want to just study Rome a little bit, I would say study Cicero, and all the main events of Rome you can learn from how they related to Cicero. If your time is limited, Cicero is the most interesting thing about ancient Rome. Okay, similes are common, metaphors are rare. Like, think how often do you hear somebody make a clever metaphor? That's rare. That's why they're so powerful. It's a sign that that person's really smart. Okay, metaphor takes you farther. It attributes the first thing, the attributes of the first thing are transported to the second thing. The zeitgeist of the second thing is to the first. And the reason I'm going through all this is because a metaphor is like one of the most powerful things in all of human thought, one of the most powerful things in all of writing. And developing a knack for it will really elevate your writing skills. Somebody could read an entire chapter and all they're going to remember is that metaphor. So if that metaphor is good, it can make the whole book chapter quite good, or the whole lecture quite good. So a metaphor gets the reader to use their imagination and to picture the event. Aristotle, the most important thing by far for a public speaker is to master the use of metaphor. I've actually got the rest of that quote on the next page. Okay, visual metaphor is powerful, gets them to see it in their mind's eye. We're more visual than anything else. And here's kind of a nice one by Emily Dickinson. Usually I don't like Emily Dickinson. I think she's kind of a pain in the ass. But I like this one by Emily Dickinson, this little poem called Hope is a Thing with Feathers. Hope is a thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. Okay, Frank Smith, he's a really smart linguist guy from Harvard. He wrote a lot of good books. My favorite book by him is Insult to One's Intelligence. So here's his quote. It has been argued that it is only through metaphor that we can get ideas into the brain. The first automobiles were horseless carriages. And that's actually a good statement. Basically, the way we learn anything, it comes into anything logical, any declarative memory. The new item comes in and we then compare and process it compared to what we already know. That's like our own existing knowledge is the scaffold for understanding anything new. You have to know certain things before you can learn certain things related to them. So anyways, that's how the brain works. So whenever you learn something new and you really want to remember it, just say to yourself, how does this relate to the things I already know? And like have a little conversation with yourself. Usually when I learn something new that I think is interesting, I will call one of my friends right away. Because I know if I have a conversation, like let's say I just looked up something, I saw an interesting brain case and there was a surprise finding and then I figured it out or somehow somebody told me or I looked it up, I'll immediately call my friend and discuss it with him because then it'll be locked in my brain forever. I know that if I don't discuss it with somebody else or I don't write it down and keep notes on my disease findings, I will forget it potentially. Okay, plus it'll keep running around in my head until I'll keep saying, don't forget this. But if I write it down or call my friend, then it just ends up being locked in. Okay, metaphors hold the most truth in the least space. Orson Card in American Knowledge. Yeah, that's a good point too. So just a one-line metaphor can tie a whole bunch of things together. It's a very powerful way to write and talk. Okay, here's a quote by Jerry Spence. He's a super famous lawyer, great lawyer. He wrote a great book. I forgot the name of his book, but it was really good. And he talks about the power of telling the truth. So the best arguments dazzle with metaphor. So if you ever, he's a good guy to learn about knowing how to speak better in public. Because what I've also seen is now that I've been through life, for a pretty good amount of time, I've kind of seen how different people go through life. And basically being more articulate, it is really strongly in your best interest. It helps protect you in a sense that if somebody messes with you, you can at least argue back. You can at least verbally or in writing defend yourself versus what I've seen is a lot of people are essentially helpless. They're, nice people. Most people I meet are pretty nice, but most people I meet are also kind of functional illiterates, and no one says, oh, I'm not illiterate. And then you ask them a question. What books have you read this week? Oh, no, I've been too busy. What books did you read this month? Oh, I've been too busy. What books did you read this year? I've been too busy. If you don't read, that means you're a functional illiterate. I mean, that's by definition. And most people never read another book after they finish high school, and they only read stuff they were required to. High school turns them off from reading, but it's just a fact. And it's kind of sad because as a population is functionally illiterate, that means they can't understand modern events very well. The way you understand modern events is you compare them to stuff that happened in the past. So I'm getting off on a side tangent there. Okay, next, extended metaphor. Perhaps the greatest extended metaphor is the book Animal Farm by George Orwell. And it's an extended metaphor of the Russian Revolution of 1917, of communism. It's a great book, Animal Farm. And 1984 by Orwell is an even greater book. Some of the greatest books ever written. Okay, the following is an extended metaphor of religion. This one is from St. Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas is like one of my heroes too. He sort of was a very syncretic Catholic scholar who brought together Greek philosophy and Catholicism. And basically a lot of Catholicism is based indirectly, at least, on Greek philosophy. It'll say it's not, but there's a tremendous overlap, certainly. Some people have even said, I think it was Nietzsche who said, Catholicism is just Platonism for the masses. So anyways, here's a quote by Thomas Aquinas. Suppose a person entering a house were to feel heat on the porch, and going further inward were to feel the heat increasing. The more they penetrated within, such a person would believe there was a fire in the house, even though they did not see the fire that must be causing all the heat. A similar thing will happen to anyone who considers the world in detail. One will observe that all things are arranged according to their degrees of beauty and excellence, and that the nearer they are to God, the more beautiful and better they are. Okay, the following is the most famous of the extended metaphors in evolutionary biology. This is called The Selfish Gene, and it was written by Richard Dawkins. He's sort of like the most famous Darwinist atheist in the world. He's a professor from England, and he's a bright guy, but he's also kind of a pain in the ass. If you try reading his books, he's so monotone, and he's such a pompous know-it-all jackass that I always had a hard time with his books because they would just bore me and annoy me. So I would listen to him, and I've finished a couple of his books, but I never really liked him that much. And I think he's a liar too, because he says stuff, he tries to pretend about all these things about Darwinism and evolution are proven, and they're not. I majored in evolutionary biology at Stanford, so I've still read a whole bunch of books on the subject. So don't get me wrong, Dawkins is a bright guy, and he does have some great metaphors like this one here. It's fantastic, but he's also a BSer. Okay, so here we go. Now they swarm in huge colonies, safe inside gigantic lumbering robots, sealed off from the outside world, communicating with it by tortuous indirect routes, manipulating it by remote control. They are in you and me. They created us, body and mind, and their preservation is the ultimate rationale for our existence. So what he's basically saying is, the selfish genes that are inside of us are the only reason we exist, that we are just like a big, almost like a robot that just enables our genes to move around. So it's a little bit of a deterministic, fatalistic attitude about life, and I think it's actually scientifically incorrect, but it's still brilliant and entertaining. So here's Dennis Noble. He's another real famous evolutionary biologist. And he's the guy who wrote a book about the new synthesis, new ideas in evolutionary biology. The original Darwinism, wasn't that good at explaining genetic variety, nor was neo-Darwinism. And so here's what Dennis Noble has to say. He says, the selfish gene is not falsifiable. Therefore, it is not science. Okay, and that's sort of like the proper definition of science. It must be falsifiable. But truth be known, I think science doesn't have to be falsifiable, not at all times. What I'm saying is there are times when the key task at hand is to develop a plausible narrative based on the known facts that enables you to make predictions. And if you're able to make useful predictions, then you have done something useful. So here's Richard Dawkins. The fundamental truth is that an organism is a tool of DNA rather than the other way around. Evolution is a fact. Genetic variability is explained by random mutations. And those are actually big statements that are not true. What do you mean by evolution? You can get explainable genetic variety from random mutations within a genus, okay, within an individual species, maybe even extending up to the family level. But this evolutionary random mutations, it cannot explain genetic variety at higher levels, phylum, kingdom, and all this other stuff. It just can't. And it has nothing to do with the origin of life. That's abiogenesis, okay? Geologic chemistry. It's not biologic chemistry. Can't explain the origin of the universe and a whole bunch of other things. Okay, it can't explain the human eye, the human brain, the flagellum, the immune system, the clotting system, etc. Okay, anyways, they try to use evolutionary biology and Darwinism as like a creation story for atheism. It's bogus, so don't be fooled by that. Don't be a chump. Okay, Dennis Noble says, digital music is numbers. If you scratch a CD, an audio CD, to randomly change the numbers, you will not improve the music. DNA is digital code. Random mutations are like random scratches on an audio CD. They cannot explain genetic variety. Right, they're always going to degrade things, okay? Can you imagine human DNA? We've got 3.3 billion base pairs. Do you think that randomly damaging it is going to make it better? Could any person, the smartest person on Earth, if you got off 1,000 of the smartest people on Earth, they can't write DNA code. It's so much more complicated than anything they could do. So to think that that all just happened by accident, yeah, right. People say that because they don't understand it. The more you understand it and you see how complicated it is, the more you realize. Look at that T. Colin Campbell, that brilliant guy, deserves a Nobel Prize, or he's the guy who wrote the book China Study. And he'll tell you that the more he studied biochemistry, and he's an emeritus professor of the subject, 85 years old. This is a genius guy who studied biochemistry all his life. He says, it's so complicated, we could never really fully understand it. But we simply, can get a sense of things and here and there, and we can map out a couple of reactions and some pathways, and we can do some useful work with it, but we can never fully understand it. It's too complicated. It's too holistic. And so Remember that, okay? That's what the really best people say, the ones who really know it. And you got all these like phony bullshitters on the internet who say evolution's a fact, it's proven, there is no God. Yeah, right, you bullshitter. Okay, anyways, now we're going to talk about a type of extended metaphor with diacope. That means repetition of a word or parts of a word. And these create more. Basically, the really good writers, what they do is they don't just use one type of rhetoric. They use multiple types of rhetoric within their sentence or their paragraph. And when you put them all together, it amplifies the emotional impact of the statement. So here's this same Thomas Shaw's psychiatrist guy, and he knows a lot and he tells the truth. Here's what he says. In the Animal King, the rule is eat or be eaten. In the human kingdom, it's define or be defined. He who defines dominates. So that's very true. And so, like, what does that come down to? Basically, if one person has more ability to promote their message, to, like, let's say one candidate has tons more airtime, tons more money for commercials, they can sort of set the terms of the situation and they're going to do better even if the other candidate is much more talented. Okay, next, a quote from similes can be extended in the form of a comparison. Here's Joseph Addison. A coach is to a team what a teacher is to a class. Reading is to the mind what exercise is to the body. Sort of like the form of that is A is to B as C is to D. All right, here's an escalated metaphor. And this is Thomas Shaz again. And this is the kind of stuff that made him really famous. This guy was super famous in, let's say, the 1960s and 70s for his criticism of psychology and psychiatry. And here's what Shaz has to say. Psychotherapy is medicalization through and through, 100%. So of taking human social problems and fake illnesses and making them into a medical problem. So psychotherapy is medicalization. Psychoanalysis is medicalization squared. And psychiatry is medicalization cubed. Thomas Shaz, from The Myth of Mental Illness. Again, if you want to understand some psychiatry and psychotherapy, you should read Thomas Shaz. I'll also tell you something. I've read quite a bit about psychiatry, psychotherapy, neuropsychopharmacology, and I've also read about Christian psychotherapy and counseling, and I kind of think you really benefit a lot from the Christian component. So people say, oh, what are you talking about? People have problems. You don't need religion to analyze a problem. I'll tell you why it helps. Because you need an ethical foundation. How can you decide what is a good life for me to live? How should I live my life? Unless you have a metaphysics in place, you have a sense of values. What is good? What is right? How can I live a good life? What does it mean to be a good person? And I can tell you, the life of Jesus Christou and the stuff in the Bible, a lot of that is very helpful for figuring that out. And that's not just my opinion. If you look at, for example, Alcoholics Anonymous, the ones who sort of transferred a lot of their previous addiction energy to religion, they had much better outcomes. And that's been the case for a lot of other issues in psychology. Plus, a lot of psychological problems come from diet and lifestyle. And if you fix that, you got a chance to improve. Now, don't get me wrong. Sometimes it's more severe than that. I've seen intense depression and stuff and other mental illnesses that are more severe than that. And that stuff alone is not going to work. I realize that. But this other stuff does have its role. And most people, their problems are minor. The severe ones are not as common. Okay, the energizing myth, the dynamic metaphor. Yeah, that also helps. If people believe in their group, their society, that energizes them to perform better in that context. You know, like Florence. They were so proud of themselves in the Renaissance, deservedly so, and they produced magnificent art. And the Medicis sort of led the way, you know. You kind of a lot of times need a funder to free up the other people to have more time. The whole story of the Renaissance and the competition between Florence and Rome is great stuff. Okay, here's a quote from Jane Hirshfield, an American poet. She says, metaphors get under your skin by ghosting right past the logical mind. And that's true. They'll have an emotional impact, a good metaphor, and that can convince people, even if, and they don't even bother to look at the logic. And a lot of times the logic will be flawed, but the metaphor overwhelms them emotionally, and that carries more weight in the human brain. Okay, metaphors are powerful persuaders. This guy, John Pollock, he wrote a good book called Shortcuts, all about the power of metaphors and how they work. And he talks about how you can use good metaphors to motivate people. So here's his quote, John Pollock from Shortcuts. A good metaphor can trigger emotions that lead to a desired pattern of thinking and behavior in others. The goal is to get them to accept the overt. Oh wait, gosh, I kind of missed the quote because my little things here. Let me see if I can. Oh, I can't. Oh, I can move it. The goal is to get them to accept the overt premise, even though it is the covert connotation that gets you the benefit. So that's a very clever statement. So what he's basically saying is there'll be some component of the metaphor that's obviously true or seems obviously true, and as soon as they accept that, or it seems like no big deal to accept it, as soon as they accept that, they've indirectly now accepted a whole bunch of other things. I think a good example of this is when you talk about what is the definition of a human. If a human is created in the image of God, lots of good things flow from that. They thus can be a creator like God. Thus there is a rational universe and they can learn and study science and understand the world. Thus they are entitled to natural rights. On the other hand, if you say, oh, no, atheistic Darwinism explains the origin of man, he's just a talking primate, everything changes. And this is the defined definition of a human in our society and in all the universities. They don't even allow these other things to be taught, what I'm talking about here, Michelangelo, intelligent design, etc. So then you're saying you're just a talking primate. Then for you have no rights, zero, none. There is no God. You have no soul. There's nothing divine about you. Then you're not entitled to anything. You're not entitled to property. You're not entitled to a family. Nothing. That's what you use for slavery. And that's why a lot of people, they think Darwinism is great. You don't even understand it. If you really understand it, I studied it for many years. It is used by imperialistic cultures and eugenics cultures to control people and enslave them, okay? And it's not true. So that's important stuff to know how that all works. You have to be able to build up from the foundational metaphysics. Otherwise, you end up being chumped by something. Okay, Jose Ortega Gasset. He had a couple good quotes. He's kind of a difficult writer to read, but he does hit on some great quotes. He says, the efficacy of metaphor verges on magic. The metaphor is probably the most fertile power possessed by man. Yeah, because that's how we learn stuff. And the fact that we can learn so much enables us to, civilize the whole world potentially. Okay. Live everywhere in the world, etc. Okay, Paul Deman, metaphors are much more tenacious than facts. And that kind of goes back to the same concept of it ghosting past logic. Once people grasp onto a metaphor, a slogan, a little soundbite that they feel compelled to follow, it can just control their behavior. Like I said, good fats can get people to eat all kinds of terrible food and plug up their arteries. And there's a lot of metaphors like that in regular life that can get people to behave in a way that they would not behave because they're too lazy and stupid to actually check the premises of the metaphor and the metaphysics and behavior and thoughts that it leads to. They simply just accept it. And then all of a sudden they find themselves like, pulled down that logical path without even understanding it. Okay, so here's a more detailed quote by Aristotle on metaphor. And by the way, I love Aristotle too. Aristotle is the great hero of philosophy. Okay, Aristotle says, it is the mark of genius to make good metaphors. It is the one thing that cannot be learned from others. A good metaphor implies an intuitive perception of the similar and the dissimilar, a skill for noticing common essences. Aristotle. So yeah, it's hard to fake a good metaphor. If you really know something, you'll see the metaphors. But if you don't really know it, you can't fake that with the metaphors. Okay, Aristotle continues, ordinary words convey only what we already know. It is from metaphor that we can best get hold of something new. It's a great statement. Okay, to write a winning metaphor, you want to highlight desirable similarities and obscure the unnecessary or undesirable differences. The goal of a persuasive metaphor is to get people to quickly grasp the connection and then springboard to the right conclusion. There was a guy by the name of John Boyd. He was an American fighter pilot in the 1950s, a little bit in the 1960s. The guy was a genius, and he figured out all kinds of things about strategic thinking and other things. And it was from him I learned the trick that whenever you have a good idea, immediately call a friend and talk to them about it, and that'd be especially for me, medical stuff. And I mean, this is when I'm at work with a medical idea, fascinating case, boom, call my friend, and it's locked in my brain for good. Okay, so anyways, here's a statement about the book about Boyd by Robert Coram. It said, Boyd thought by analogy, a process that his friend, ever the pragmatist, found extremely unsettling. He found it even more unsettling that Boyd was always right. This guy Boyd, he would call people up at 2 o'clock in the morning if he had a good idea to discuss it with him. And so his close friends, they really appreciated being able to talk to Boyd, so they let it go. But even though he was a little bit nuts as well. But yeah, I really liked him when I read about him. I read a couple other books about him too. I liked him so much. Okay, earlier we talked about the limitations of working memory. You can only hold one thought in your mind at a time. You can keep track of 7 plus or minus 2 items floating around in your head at a time. So Here's a quote by Daniel Willingham from his book, Why Students Don't Like School. It's called Working Memory is a Bottleneck to Cognition. And so the point of all this is, how did our ancestors in the primitive world learn new things and remember them? And, it's obviously with metaphors. Because a metaphor is like chunking. You can put a whole bunch of items together and thus make yourself only thinking of one thing, I think about recognizing a person's face. There's eyes, ears, nose, mouth, facial expression, facial hair, top of the head hair, and you just say that's whoever that is, and you don't need to go anywhere else beyond that. Okay, and that's like chunking in a sense. Let's see. The best teachers are the ones that have good metaphors. Quote by Tony Robbins. He's kind of an entertaining speaker. I don't think he's the best of the public speakers. I like Brian Tracy a lot better, but Tony Robbins did some good things. I do like him. Okay, the object of science is to recognize the many in the one, to perceive the rules in any given example, and not to go on counting up facts ad infinitum. Yeah, that's a good quote by Schopenhauer. And what Schopenhauer is getting at is a really good scientist gives you a metaphor that helps you to understand something, and then you could go from there. You could work from there. Versus the typical science BS. If you read like scientific journals and papers, you'll see endless numbers of papers. The majority of papers in a journal will be all this statistical analysis with the p-value shows a 10% improvement, and almost all of those papers are BS. They're almost all worthless. Okay, it'll be often I'll read a journal in my own field, and it'll only be like one article out of 50 is of any use to me, and it'll be an article where they make a clever metaphor. I'm like, oh yes, now I understand that. Okay, metaphors and similes are of great value as far as they can explain an unknown relation by a known one. Okay, this is a quote by Schopenhauer. Trust me, Schopenhauer is great. His book, The Art of Literature, is magnificent. He's a grouchy old guy in Germany who, sort of had an inheritance, so he didn't have to work. And he just sat around reading all day, like in 5 different languages. And he made all kinds of brilliant observations. And he wasn't very popular in his time. He couldn't get a job as a philosopher, even though he's like perhaps the best philosopher Germany ever produced. I learned a lot more from him than I did from Nietzsche. Nietzsche's entertaining, but I don't get hardly anything useful from him. From Schopenhauer, I got a lot of useful things. So here's Schopenhauer talking about metaphor and how we understand and learn things. Metaphors and similes are of great value insofar as they explain an unknown thing by a known one. Even the more detailed simile, which grows into a parable or an allegory, is nothing more than the exhibition of some relation in its simplest, most visible and palpable form. The growth of ideas rests at bottom upon simile and metaphor because the ideas arise by a process of combining the similarities and neglecting the differences between things. Intelligence, in the strict sense of the word, ultimately consists in a seizing of the relations between things, and a clear and pure grasp of relations is all the more often attained when the comparison is made between cases that lie wide apart from one another and between things that things of quite a different nature. As long as the relation is known to me, existing in only a single case, I have but an individual idea of it. In other words, only an intuitive knowledge of it. But as soon as I see that same relation in 2 cases, I then have a general idea of the whole nature, and it is a deeper and more perfect knowledge. And so that statement about a brilliant metaphor often takes 2 things that seem quite far apart, that'll remind me of like Frank Lloyd Wright. For example, Frank Lloyd Wright, spent some time in Asia looking at like Japanese tea gardens, and he kind of compared that with some of the Western architectural ideas and the old Greek forms of architecture and Roman architecture forms, and he kind of combined them into his new style. And it was amazing and it was great. And that was the point. By taking 2 things that seem far apart and putting them together in some ways, you can come up with something brilliant and new. Okay, here's another Schopenhauer quote. Since similes and metaphors are such a powerful engine of knowledge, it is a sign of great intelligence in a writer if his similes are unusual and at the same time to the point. And I know that feeling. That's Arthur Schopenhauer. It's like if I'm reading and all of a sudden the author surprises me with a metaphor. That doesn't happen to me that often. So when that happens, man, I'm like, this is a good writer. And then I'll try to read as much as I can from that person. And whenever I have that happen, and it does happen a lot, but I mean, you know how it is. If you read a lot of books, you got to read a whole bunch of them before you get one that's really great. It's sort of like, anyways. It's a real sign. When somebody surprises you with a great metaphor simile, that's a sign. I can learn a lot more from that person probably. Okay, John Pollock continues. A good metaphor can override the resistance of others. A metaphor can be a fulcrum slogan. Okay, here's a quote from Robert Pirsig from Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, a great book. He said, Phaedrus began to wonder if the word dialectic had some special meaning that made it a fulcrum word, one that could shift the balance of an argument depending on how it was placed, and it was. So yeah, that's a great book. That idea of quality, going back to before the dialectic. Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance is worth reading. To create, now this is a quote by Colin Martindale, to create involves the realization of an analogy between two previously unassociated mental elements. A lot of times that's the key point. And a lot of times you'll have a breakthrough on a subject where you'll study for days, weeks, months, sometimes years. And then one morning just, sitting in bed saying, should I get up yet? What time is it probably? All of a sudden, the idea comes to you. Jump out of bed and write it down. Okay, here's a quote by Arthur Koestler. He's a guy from Eastern Europe. At first he was sort of pro-commie, and then he changed his mind on it big time when he learned more about it. Koestler speaks, the real achievement in discoveries is seeing the analogy where no one saw it before. The essence of a discovery is previously unrelated frames of reference whose union will solve the previously insoluble problem. Okay, it's a good quote. Okay, so yeah, metaphors are how we learn new things. We understand the new by comparing it to the old. Metaphors are the key to learning and therefore essential to the brain and human life. This lady, Ayn Rand, I think she's the smartest lady who ever lived. Here's just another one of her quotes. When you hear people talking about minorities and all this stuff, listen to what she has to say about it. The smallest minority on earth is the individual. She is a great proponent of individualism and creativity. So she's one of my academic heroes, and I've read a lot of her stuff. People always say, oh, she's a bitch, she's selfish, all these other bad things about her. She's a little crazy like all geniuses are, but when she's on her game, man, about writing, philosophy, history, literature, she's great. She's awesome. Okay, here's a couple of religious metaphors, from John. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. John chapter 9, verse 5. John here is chapter 10, verse 14. I am the good shepherd. I lay down my life for the sheep. John chapter 14, verse 6. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Okay, now here's 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8. Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, is a roaring lion that walketh about, seeking whom he may devour. All right, well, anyways, hope that was helpful.